When Clara Whitfield opened her front door that blistering Arizona evening, her breath caught in her throat. Frank, just a step behind, froze too. Their old golden retriever Max sat calmly in the corner, eyes fixed not on them, but on something else. Curled on Max's oversized bed as though she owned the place was a wild bobcat. Spotted coat rising and falling with steady breaths, tufted ears twitching, she looked like danger draped in fur. Not a thief, not a ghost, a predator. Clara's first instinct was fear, but Max didn't move. No growl, no bark, just quiet, steady acceptance. The house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Frank whispered, "Don't move." The bobcat's golden eyes opened slowly, locking with theirs. In that charged moment, Clara realized this wasn't an accident. This creature had chosen their home. Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she couldn't look away. The bobcat's gaze held hers, wild and unflinching, yet not threatening. Max shifted on his paws, giving one slow wag of his tail, as if to say, "It's okay." Clara's lips trembled. "Frank," she whispered, "she's not attacking." The bobcat blinked once, her sides shuddering with exhaustion. Then Clara noticed something else. Her back leg dragged slightly, the faintest limp, even as she adjusted her body. Not strong, not dominant, wounded. Frank clenched his jaw. "She's hurt." The air between them buzzed with tension, man, dog, and wildcat sharing one fragile moment of understanding. Clara knew they should call someone, but something in those golden eyes stopped her. They weren't filled with menace, they were filled with desperation, and something else she couldn't name.
Frank's hand fumbled for the phone, but Clara pressed it down. "Wait," she breathed. "She's not here to fight." Frank's brow furrowed. "Clara, that's a wild bobcat, not some stray cat from the alley. She could tear Max apart." Yet Max only shifted slightly, laying his head back down with a sigh. Clara stepped closer to Frank, her voice trembling but certain. "Look at her. She's starving and limping. If she meant harm, she would have struck already." The bobcat twitched her ears at their voices, body tense but unmoving. Frank swallowed, torn between instinct and reason. Clara whispered again, "Maybe she just needed somewhere cool, somewhere safe." Frank exhaled through his nose. "You're crazy," he muttered, but he didn't call. Instead, the three of them, elderly couple, aging dog, and desperate bobcat, remained locked in that fragile truce as the desert sun slid lower outside. 40 minutes later, the creak of tires outside broke the spell. Wildlife Officer Jason Hall stepped through the door, his tan uniform stiff in the heat. His eyes widened at the sight. "Well, that's a first." His voice was calm, but laced with warning. "She's young, thin, and you don't want her in here." Clara wanted to argue, but Jason continued firmly. "Bobcats carry disease. They can turn aggressive without warning. You've been lucky." Max gave a soft huff, as if disagreeing. Jason studied the scene, hand hovering near his tranquilizer gear, but before he acted, the bobcat stirred. With a stretch that mirrored a house cat, she rose gracefully, tail twitching. Clara held her breath as Juno, though Clara hadn't yet named her, padded silently to the doggy door. She paused at the threshold, turned, and met Clara's gaze again before slipping into the desert dusk. The house was quiet once more, but Clara couldn't shake the image. That moment when the bobcat had looked back, steady, deliberate, almost human. "She wasn't afraid," Clara murmured, pacing the kitchen. "Not really." Frank busied himself, pouring water into Max's bowl to avoid her eyes. "She left. That's the end of it." But Clara shook her head slowly. "No, she'll be back." She replayed the limp, the thinness, the way her sides seemed rounder than hunger alone might explain. Clara's voice lowered to a whisper. "Frank, I think she's pregnant." His shoulders stiffened. "That's exactly why we don't want her here," he snapped, but his voice cracked. Max whined softly, laying back in the bed that still held faint traces of wild fur. Clara placed her hand on Frank's. "Please, she needs us." That night, Clara set a heavy ceramic bowl of water on the shaded porch, just outside the doggy door. Frank scowled, but didn't stop her. "You're feeding trouble." Clara only shook her head. "Water isn't food. It's mercy." The desert air was still blistering, even after sunset, and she imagined the bobcat padding through the dust, parched throat desperate for relief. Inside, Max lay quietly, his ears flicking at every desert sound. Frank sat in his chair, muttering about risks, diseases, neighbors. But Clara's eyes were fixed on the dark edge of the yard, where shadows pooled like secrets. Hours passed, and still she waited. At last, just before midnight, the motion light flicked on. A spotted silhouette moved cautiously across the gravel. Golden eyes gleamed, ears sharp. The bobcat lowered her head, drinking deeply, every movement wary yet grateful. Clara smiled faintly. "Welcome back." 2 mornings later, Frank dragged out an old dog bed, one Max had long since outgrown. He muttered excuses, "Better here than inside," but Clara saw the softness in his eyes. They placed it under the covered porch, shaded from the punishing sun, just close enough to view from the kitchen window. The bed looked almost ridiculous sitting there, but Clara's heart swelled. She brewed coffee early, eyes glued to the glass. For 2 days, nothing came. Then, as dawn painted the mountains gold, Clara gasped. There she was. The bobcat circled the bed with suspicion, sniffed every inch, tested it with one paw. Her limp was clear, her sides rounder. For a long moment, she seemed ready to bolt, but then, with a sigh, she lowered herself onto the cushion, her body relaxed, eyes half closing. Clara's voice trembled. "She's chosen us, Frank. She trusts us." From that day forward, a strange rhythm settled in. Every few mornings, the bobcat appeared. Sometimes she lingered for hours, stretched long and regal on the cushion. Other times, she came only to drink, her movements slow but steady. Max would watch from inside, tail wagging faintly. He never barked, he never lunged. Instead, he seemed to recognize something unspoken, some bond that didn't need words. Clara whispered through the glass once, "Juno." It was a name that rose unbidden, and it fit. The wildcat's ears twitched as though she'd heard, though Clara knew she hadn't. Frank refused to use the name, but he no longer complained. At night, they'd review motion camera footage together, like proud grandparents, marveling at her elegance. A predator had entered their home, but what she'd left behind was something neither Clara nor Frank could quite explain.
When Jason Hall stopped by weeks later for a routine neighborhood check, Clara's heart raced. She tried to keep her face neutral, but Jason noticed the fresh water bowl and the bed on the porch. He frowned, folding his arms. "You've seen her again, haven't you?" Clara swallowed. Frank spoke first. "Just once, passed through." Jason's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. If she's coming back, it means she's getting comfortable. That's not safe, for you or for her." He lectured about habituation, about diseases, about danger. But Clara's mind wasn't on his words. It was on the memory of Juno's golden eyes, the way she settled like she belonged. When Jason left, Frank muttered, "He's right, you know." But Clara whispered firmly, "She's not a threat. She's Mother. She needs us." Max barked once, soft and low, as if in agreement. It was a storm that drove her back. Rain lashed the desert, thunder rattled windows, lightning split the sky. Max whined, uneasy at the sound. Then, with a suddenness that stole Clara's breath, the doggy door flapped open. Juno stepped through, soaked, her spotted coat dripping onto the tiles. Clara froze. Frank rose halfway from his chair.
Max didn't move. His tail wagged faintly as Juno shook herself and limped toward his bed. She paused, eyes flicking toward them, ears swiveling. Then, with a grace that felt surreal, she pressed her nose gently against Max's. The old dog sighed, shifting just enough to share his space. Clara clutched Frank's arm, tears in her eyes. The storm raged outside, but in their living room, something unthinkable had happened. Predator and pet, wild and domestic, had made a silent pact of peace.
Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring out the rain-washed window. She whispered again, "Juno." The name slipped out softly, like a prayer, as if naming her made the wildcat less of a mystery and more of a companion. Frank grunted from his chair, pretending not to hear. "Don't start naming her. She's not a pet." But Clara saw how his eyes followed the porch, waiting for the next glimpse. Max lay in his bed, eyes heavy with age, yet each time the bobcat appeared, his tail flicked in quiet joy. Juno didn't act like a threat. She acted like she belonged. A wild predator had crossed the threshold of their home, and somehow, their hearts had let her in. Clara's voice quivered as she whispered, "She's family now, whether you like it or not." Frank said nothing. Silence was his truest agreement. Nicole Carter phoned from Phoenix that Sunday. Clara answered cheerfully, but Nicole's voice cut sharp. "Mom, Dad told me about the bobcat." Clara's stomach tightened. Nicole's words tumbled fast. "Are you insane? That's a predator. What if it turns on you? What if Max gets hurt?" Clara defended softly. "She's not like that. She's hurt. She needs rest." Nicole scoffed. "Mom, you're romanticizing a wild animal. It doesn't love you. It doesn't care." Frank, listening from the recliner, muttered, "She's got a point." Clara's heart sank, but she looked at Max, who dozed peacefully, unbothered, waiting for his unusual companion to return. "Sometimes care doesn't need to be logical," Clara whispered after Nicole hung up. That night, she left the porch light burning, praying Juno would find her way back through the dark desert. She was no longer a guest. She was a promise.
The desert was still when Clara awoke near midnight. A faint sound, the scrape of claws against gravel, pulled her to the window. There, under the floodlight, Juno stood. Rain-soaked once again, her coat clung thin, her ribs faint beneath her spots. Clara's chest tightened. The bobcat stepped toward the porch, golden eyes flashing briefly in the light before melting into the shadows. Then she returned, padding silently to the water bowl, lapping with quick, desperate motions. Frank joined Clara, rubbing his eyes. "See, she's getting dependent," he whispered, worry threading his voice. Clara shook her head. "She's surviving, that's all." Max padded to the door, tail wagging faintly. Juno lifted her head, gazing directly at the old retriever. Their silent exchange lingered. Two creatures, one wild, one tame, bound by something even humans couldn't fully name. Frank muttered, "God help us," but didn't look away. Weeks passed, and Clara noticed something she couldn't ignore. Juno's sides, once gaunt and hollow, had grown round. Not the roundness of a predator fattening on prey, it was softer, fuller. Clara's hand trembled as she whispered, "She's pregnant." Frank swallowed, his expression unreadable. Max, too, seemed to sense it, his tail wagging faintly each time she appeared. Clara kept her voice low, fearful even the walls might betray their secret. "She's chosen here because she feels safe." Frank leaned back heavily, sighing. "If she's expecting kittens, that's all the more reason she doesn't belong under our roof." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Or maybe it's the reason she does. That night, she sat awake long after Frank had gone to bed, watching the porch through the window, praying silently for the young mother who had turned their ordinary lives into something extraordinary.
Jason Hall returned, leaning on their porch railing with suspicion. He eyed the bed and water bowls, then fixed Clara with a stare. She's coming back often, isn't she?
Clara hesitated. Frank stepped in, his voice steady but defensive. Every few days, sometimes more. Jason shook his head. You're crossing a line. Bobcats aren't pets. If she's pregnant, that's even more dangerous. She'll be protective. You'll regret this. Clara's voice cracked. She trusts us. Doesn't that count for something? Jason sighed. Wild animals don't trust. They survive. Don't fool yourself, Mrs. Whitfield. When instinct takes over, no kindness will protect you. He left them with a warning. Secure the house. Lock the doggy door. Think of Max's safety. But as his truck drove away, Clara stared at the horizon where Juno often appeared. For her, it wasn't just survival. It was something deeper. It happened one crisp morning in November. The sliding door had been left cracked open for fresh air, Max lying lazily in the sunbeam spilling across the floor. Clara sipped coffee when movement caught her eye. Juno padded onto the porch, cautious but calm. Her golden eyes flicked from Clara to Max. Then, to Clara's astonishment, she stepped forward. Nose to nose, wild bobcat and old retriever, touched, delicate, fleeting, but real. Max's tail wagged once, slow and certain. Clara's hand shook, nearly spilling her coffee. Frank stood frozen, his mouth parted. Well, I'll be, he muttered. The world seemed to stop in that moment. Predator and pet, wild and tame, acknowledging each other in silent truce. Clara whispered, "See? She's not danger." Frank, voice rough with awe, replied, "Or maybe she's more dangerous than we'll ever understand." But neither looked away.
Nicole drove down unexpectedly, her car crunching into the gravel drive. She stormed into the kitchen, eyes sharp. "Enough! You're letting a bobcat into your house?" Clara flushed, her hands twisting. "It's not what you think." Nicole cut her off. "It's exactly what I think. You're risking your lives. That animal doesn't love you, it's using you." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Nikki, it's complicated." Nicole's eyes brimmed with tears. "Dad, Mom, what if it hurts you? What if it hurts Max?" Clara's voice broke. "She's carrying life. She chose us because she felt safe." Nicole shook her head. "You're blinded." The house filled with tense silence. Max padded over, pressing his muzzle against Clara's leg, as though siding with her. Nicole's jaw tightened. "If something happens, it'll be on your conscience." She left, slamming the door. Clara's whispered reply lingered. "Or on my heart." The desert storm came without warning. Rain slashing sideways, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Clara and Frank huddled near the window as Max whimpered. Then, through the doggy door, Juno slipped inside, drenched, her spotted coat clinging to her thin frame. She shook violently, scattering droplets across the tile. Clara's breath caught. Frank stiffened. Max wagged faintly, padding forward to meet her. Juno's ears twitched at the thunder, but she didn't run. Instead, she pressed close to Max, curling beside him on the rug. Clara's eyes welled. "She trusts us completely," she whispered. Frank's hands trembled as he whispered back, "Or she's got nowhere else to go." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a wounded bobcat and an aging retriever lay side by side, their breathing steady in unison. For Clara, it wasn't danger. It was grace itself curled quietly in her living room.
Over the next weeks, Clara's suspicion became undeniable. Juno's belly rounded, fuller each time she appeared. Her steps slowed, her movements more deliberate. Max shadowed her calmly, never hostile, always gentle. Clara whispered to Frank one night, "She's close, any day now." Frank's lips tightened. "Clara, when it happens, we can't get involved. It has to be hers alone." Clara nodded, but her chest ached with hope and fear. Nicole's warnings echoed, Jason's words lingered, but Clara's heart silenced them all. She and Frank found themselves adjusting routines, quiet mornings, fewer visitors, soft voices in the living room. Juno seemed to notice. She chose her moments carefully, slipping in when the world was still, retreating when it wasn't. Clara could feel it. Something miraculous was about to happen under their roof, a gift wrapped not in safety, but in spotted fur and fierce survival. The night came suddenly, quiet and heavy with expectation. Clara lay in bed restless when she heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound from the living room. She froze, then nudged Frank. "She's here." Together, they crept to the doorway, barely breathing. There, in the soft glow of a lamp, Juno paced restlessly on Max's bed, her sides contracting. Max lay beside her, alert but calm, his eyes never leaving hers. Clara's heart pounded. "She's labor," she whispered. Frank pulled her close, both awed and terrified. Every instinct screamed to step forward, to help, but Clara knew better. This wasn't their role. Their part was only to witness, to protect the silence. In that fragile moment, their house became more than shelter. It became sanctuary. And Juno, once predator and intruder, had become something far greater: family.
The living room was hushed, the storm outside long gone when it happened. A small, fragile cry pierced the silence. Clara clutched Frank's hand so tightly his knuckles whitened. On Max's bed, Juno lay panting, her body trembling, but her golden eyes fierce with instinct. Nestled against her spotted side was a tiny, damp kitten, its mewing fragile but insistent. Clara gasped, tears spilling unbidden. Frank muttered, voice breaking, "I'll be damned." Max remained still, his tail thumping faintly, as if offering approval. The house that had once echoed with quiet loneliness now carried the sound of new life. Clara pressed her forehead to Frank's shoulder, whispering, "She trusted us enough to bring them here." Another cry followed, and then another. Juno wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building a family, under their roof, in their sanctuary. Hours stretched like minutes as Clara and Frank stood guard, silent witnesses. Juno moved with tireless instinct, cleaning, nudging, warming. By dawn, 3 tiny kittens nestled against her, their spotted coats glistening. Max shifted only once, rising to lap water before returning to his post like a sentinel. Clara's heart ached at the sight. Predator and retriever, guardians side by side. "It's a miracle," she whispered. Frank swallowed hard, his gruffness cracking. "It's madness, too." But he didn't look away. For 3 weeks, their lives revolved around the fragile family. Coffee sipped in whispers, footsteps softened, visitors discouraged with excuses. The kittens' mews filled the house, tiny sounds that carried enormous weight. Every day, Clara wondered how long this could last. Every night she prayed it would never end. In those fragile weeks, they weren't just watching wildlife. They were part of its heartbeat.
Nicole called again, suspicion sharp in her voice. "You sound distracted, Mom. What's going on?" Clara hesitated, eyes drifting to the living room where Juno curled around her kittens. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just tired." She hated the lie, but she couldn't risk losing this fragile trust. Frank caught her gaze, saying nothing, but his silence was agreement. Officer Jason stopped by once more, his gaze flicking toward the porch bed. "No more visits?" he asked. "Not since the rain," Frank replied evenly. Jason left unconvinced, but none the wiser. Their home had become 2 worlds, ordinary on the outside, extraordinary within. Clara and Frank lived in quiet awe, guarding the secret like treasure. Every soft mew, every flick of Juno's ears felt sacred. The risk was real, but so was the bond. Some truths, Clara decided, belonged only to those who had earned them. The kittens grew quickly, eyes opening, paws unsteady but curious. Clara nearly cried when one batted at Max's tail, and the old retriever only sighed, shifting to make more room. Juno watched it all with fierce devotion, her gaze never far from her young. But beneath the wonder lay a shadow. Frank muttered one evening, "They can't stay forever." Clara's throat tightened. "I know." Outside, winter nights grew colder, and news whispered of coyotes prowling nearby. Clara feared the day Juno would decide to leave, to return her family to the unforgiving desert. But until then, she savored every stolen moment. Each wobbling step, each soft purr etched into her memory. The shadow of goodbye loomed larger each day, but Clara clung to the fragile present. For once, time wasn't just passing. It was giving them a gift no one else would believe. It happened without warning. Clara woke one morning to silence. No mews, no rustle of paws. The bed was empty. Her heart lurched as she stumbled into the living room. Gone, all of them. The house felt hollow, the quiet deafening. Frank wrapped an arm around her trembling shoulders. She did what she had to. They don't belong to us. But Clara's tears wouldn't stop. Max whimpered softly, circling the empty bed before laying down with a mournful sigh. For days, Clara checked the porch, the motion camera, the yard's edge. Nothing. It was as though they had vanished into the desert night. But deep down, she knew. Juno hadn't abandoned them. She had trusted them for as long as she could. And now she had done what mothers do, taught her children to survive, even if it meant breaking Clara's heart. Weeks passed in a haze of aching quiet. Clara moved slower, her coffee cold before she remembered to sip. Max wandered the house searching, ears flicking at every sound. Even Frank seemed deflated, his gruff voice softer than usual. "We knew this would happen," he reminded her, but his eyes betrayed the same emptiness. The porch bed remained untouched, a shrine to the wild family they had sheltered. Friends dropped by, but Clara offered no details, only polite smiles. The secret was too heavy to share, too precious to risk mocking disbelief. She would sit at the window for hours, staring at the desert horizon, remembering Juno's golden eyes. The house was still, but Clara couldn't forget the sound of tiny cries, the warmth of trust unspoken. The silence wasn't just absence, it was memory echoing louder than any words.
It was nearly a year later, under a blazing July sun, when Max passed quietly in his sleep. Clara found him curled in the same bed he had once shared with Juno. Tears streamed unchecked as Frank dug a resting place beneath the Palo Verde tree in their yard. They buried him with care, whispering thanks to the loyal friend who had bridged worlds. That evening, Clara sat hollow on the porch, grief heavy in her chest. Then she saw movement at the yard's edge. Her breath caught. Juno, but she wasn't alone. 3 young bobcats, nearly grown, followed her, lean, strong, spotted coats shimmering. They stood at the shadows, golden eyes glowing. Juno held Clara's gaze for a long, unbroken moment. Then, with solemn grace, she turned, leading her children back into the desert. Clara's tears fell freely. She came to say goodbye. Frank joined Clara, his arm around her trembling shoulders. Or maybe to say thank you, he whispered. The bobcats melted into the desert night, leaving only paw prints in the dust. Clara's heart ached, but it was softened by awe. They hadn't been forgotten. In that fleeting visit, Juno had brought proof. Her kittens had survived. Their sanctuary had mattered. Their kindness had lived on in wild blood. For weeks afterward, Clara found paw prints near the water bowl, tufts of fur on the porch. Juno no longer lingered, but she returned in traces, a shadow of reassurance. The desert was unforgiving, but Juno had carved a place for her family. And Clara knew, deep down, that her own family had been part of it, woven into a story of survival and trust that would outlast them all.
Neighbors gossiped, spinning tales of coyotes and hawks, but Clara and Frank never shared the truth. Nicole still pressed sometimes, her eyes suspicious, but Clara only smiled. Some stories were too wild for ordinary telling. Instead, she and Frank kept it close. replaying the nights of kittens mewing, of Max and Juno lying side by side. The old dog's bed remained on the porch, though Molly, the rescue shepherd they later adopted, never touched it. It stood like a relic, a silent reminder. The world might call it reckless, even dangerous, but to Clara it had been sacred. Wild had met domestic, predator had lain with pet, and trust had bloomed in the unlikeliest of places. They didn't need to tell it, they only needed to remember it. And remember they would, for the rest of their days. On quiet mornings, Clara still sat at the kitchen window with her coffee, the desert stretching vast and unforgiving outside. Sometimes she thought she saw movement at the tree line, just shadows, or maybe golden eyes watching from the brush. She no longer waited desperately. She no longer wept. Instead, she smiled. Because she knew Juno was out there, alive, carrying the memory of their home. "Funny," she whispered once. "We thought we gave her shelter, but maybe she gave it to us." Frank nodded silently, his weathered hand covering hers. In that final truth lay the payoff of it all. Kindness offered freely always returns, though not always in the ways we expect. A wild bobcat had entered their home, shaken their lives, and left behind something eternal. Not fear, not regret, but love, quiet, fierce, and unforgettable.